Listen, something happened that should terrify anyone who actually understands how the American economy works. And the problem is that most people heard it, shrugged, and moved on without grasping the implications. So I'm going to walk you through exactly what was said and, more importantly, what it means for your life in very concrete, very immediate ways. March 13th, 2025. The White House briefing room. Reporters assembled. Cameras rolling. The President of the United States makes a declaration that if you understand supply chains and energy systems and manufacturing networks, sounds less like confidence and more like someone announcing they're about to jump off a cliff. We don't need their cars, Trump says. We don't need their energy. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give. He's talking about Canada, not China, not some distant adversary. Canada, the country sharing a border with America that stretches 5,525 miles. The nation whose economy has been woven into American economic fabric for longer than most Americans have been alive. And here's what I need you to understand. That statement isn't strong leadership. It isn't America First policy. It's a declaration of economic war against the country America depends on, more than any other, for the basic functioning of daily life. And if anyone actually tried to implement that vision, if America actually tried to function without Canada, the consequences would be so immediate, so severe, so personally painful that within weeks, maybe days, people would be demanding it stop. Let me show you exactly why. Let's start with something you interact with constantly, something so fundamental to modern life that you probably don't think about it until it becomes expensive: energy. Specifically, the gasoline you put in your car. Every single day, without exception, the United States imports 4.3 million barrels of crude oil from Canada. Not per week, not per month, per day. That's 4.3 million barrels every 24 hours. And that figure represents 63% of all crude oil imports flowing into the United States. Canada isn't just America's largest foreign oil supplier. There's no competitor even remotely close to that volume. Mexico provides some. Saudi Arabia provides some. But Canada dominates to a degree that makes the relationship less like preference and more like dependency. Now here's where this becomes fascinating, in a way that reveals how disconnected rhetoric is from reality. The United States is currently the world's largest oil producer. American oil fields pump out more crude than Saudi Arabia produces, more than Russia, more than any other country on earth. American energy dominance is real in terms of total production. So the obvious question becomes, why does America import millions of barrels daily from Canada if American wells are producing record volumes? The answer exposes a technical reality that doesn't fit neatly into political talking points. American refineries, particularly the massive industrial complexes dotting the Midwest and lining the Gulf Coast, were specifically designed and engineered decades ago to process heavy crude oil, the thick, sulfur-rich, difficult-to-refine crude that comes from Canadian oil sands. This isn't a minor technical detail. This is fundamental infrastructure built on massive capital investment. American light, sweet crude, which is what most American domestic wells produce, is excellent oil for many purposes. It's high quality, it's easier to refine. But you cannot simply substitute it into refineries that were built, configured, and optimized for heavy Canadian crude. Not without spending billions of dollars on complete retooling and years on engineering and construction. Let me give you a specific example to make this concrete. Marathon Petroleum operates a refinery in Robinson, Illinois. That facility processes 100% Canadian crude, not 95%, not 80%, 100%. Every barrel that goes into that refinery comes from Canada. If Canadian oil stops flowing tomorrow morning at dawn, that facility doesn't reduce capacity or slow operations or find alternative suppliers. It shuts down completely. The equipment won't process anything else without fundamental redesign. And Robinson isn't unique or even unusual. According to the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission, which tracks this data carefully, The top 5 American refineries processing Canadian crude are locked into configurations that make switching to alternative suppliers somewhere between extraordinarily expensive and functionally impossible, within any time frame that matters. So what happens to prices at every gas station in America if this supply suddenly disappears? Energy economists have modeled this scenario extensively. The consensus estimate is that losing Canadian crude would increase gasoline prices by 30 to 70 cents per gallon within weeks. Not gradually, over months as markets adjust, within weeks. And that estimate assumes everything else remains stable. That assumes no panic buying when consumers hear about supply disruptions. That assumes no speculation when traders see an opportunity for profit. That assumes no additional market chaos when 4 million barrels per day, a truly massive volume, suddenly vanishes from global oil markets. In reality, the spike could be larger, faster, and more painful than the models predict. We're talking about immediate, visible, undeniable pain every single time you fill your tank. Every commute becomes more expensive. Every road trip costs more. Every business using vehicles sees operating costs jump. But crude oil represents just the opening chapter of this dependency story. Natural gas tells an even more revealing tale about how deeply American energy security depends on Canadian supply. In 2024, the United States imported 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas from Canada every single day. That's almost 100% of pipeline gas imports. Nearly every cubic foot of natural gas that crosses into America through pipelines comes from Canadian sources. The infrastructure moving this gas south, the extensive network of pipelines and compression stations and distribution systems, was all built over decades based on a foundational assumption: Canadian gas flows south to American markets, and American gas flows to coastal export terminals for shipment overseas. But here's where national statistics become intensely personal and regional. Here's where we stop talking about averages and start talking about whether your lights stay on and your home stays warm. New York, New England, the upper Midwest. These regions don't just import some Canadian natural gas as a supplement to domestic supply. They depend on it fundamentally for basic functioning. For heating homes during brutal winters, for generating the electricity that powers everything, for running the industrial operations that employ thousands. When winter temperatures plummet and demand spikes as everyone cranks up heating systems, Canadian natural gas supply isn't a convenient bonus or a nice-to-have option. It's the difference between keeping lights on and implementing rolling blackouts across major metropolitan areas. It's the difference between homes staying heated and emergency warming shelters opening because residential heating systems failed across neighborhoods. Seth Bloomsack, an energy professor at Penn State who studies these systems professionally, stated the reality bluntly when asked about replacing Canadian supply. If Canadian hydro imports get cut off, he said, you're not replacing that with wind and solar. You're replacing it with power plants burning natural gas or fuel oil. Higher emissions, higher pollution, higher costs to consumers. States like New York and Massachusetts have invested decades of political capital and billions of dollars working to reduce carbon emissions. A major component of that strategy involves purchasing clean Canadian hydroelectric power, power generated by moving water without burning anything, without emissions, without pollution. A disruption to that supply doesn't just threaten energy security in the immediate term. It obliterates climate progress that required generations of effort to achieve. Now let me shift focus, because energy, as critical as it is, represents only one dimension of this dependency equation. Let's discuss something that most Americans have never heard about, never thought about, but absolutely cannot live without: critical minerals. The United States government officially designates 50 specific minerals as critical to both economic security and national security. These aren't random selections. These are materials essential for everything from consumer electronics to military weapon systems. Out of those 50 critical minerals, America is 100% import dependent on 12 of them. Zero domestic production, complete reliance on foreign sources. For another 29 of those critical minerals, the United States depends on imports for more than 50% of supply. Canada produces over 60 different minerals and metals. That includes 21 of the 50 minerals on America's critical list. Canada also produces or refines 10 out of the 12 minerals that NATO specifically identifies as defense critical. These are materials that militaries need to function, that weapons systems require to operate, that defense industries depend on to manufacture equipment. Let me make this concrete with specific examples so this doesn't remain abstract economic theory. Potash. Canada supplies the overwhelming majority of potash used throughout American agriculture. Potash is essential for fertilizer production. Without sufficient potash, fertilizer production collapses. When fertilizer production collapses, crop yields across American farmland crater. When crop yields crater, food prices explode upward. This isn't hypothetical. This is the direct, predictable consequence of losing Canadian potash supply. Uranium. Canada ranks among the world's largest producers. American nuclear power plants, which generate nearly 20% of all electricity consumed in the United States, depend heavily on Canadian uranium supply. No uranium means no fuel for nuclear reactors. No fuel for nuclear reactors means no nuclear power generation. No nuclear power generation means replacing that 20% of electricity with something else, probably natural gas or coal, driving up costs and emissions simultaneously. Zinc, nickel, thorium, vanadium. Between 50 and 80% of American requirements for these essential materials originate from Canadian mining operations. These aren't luxury goods or optional components in manufacturing. These are fundamental inputs for steel production, for battery manufacturing, for defense systems, for electronics assembly. These are materials where supply disruptions don't create minor inconveniences or small cost increases. They create complete shutdowns of entire production lines. But here's what should genuinely alarm anyone thinking seriously about national security and military readiness: rare earth elements. The 17 metallic elements that are absolutely essential for modern military technology and advanced electronics. F-35 fighter jets require rare earth actuators to function. Guided missile systems depend on rare earth components for precision. Advanced radar and communications electronics need rare earths throughout their circuitry. Essentially, every piece of modern military hardware depends on these materials. And here's the problem that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. China dominates global rare earth supply to a degree that approaches monopoly. China refines over 90% of the world's rare earth elements. Over 90%. The United States has been desperately, urgently trying for years to reduce this dangerous dependency on a strategic competitor and potential adversary. The strategy that emerged from years of analysis and planning was clear and seemingly achievable. Partner with Canada. Combine Canadian mining expertise and geological resources with American processing technology and manufacturing capability. Build a North American rare earth supply chain completely independent from Beijing's control. Create strategic security through continental cooperation. That entire carefully constructed strategy collapses completely if you're simultaneously threatening to economically destroy your Canadian partner. In April 2025, China demonstrated exactly how vulnerable this makes America. China restricted exports of just 5 critical minerals to the United States. Just 5 out of dozens of materials China controls. Ford had to temporarily halt production at its Chicago assembly plant because of immediate shortages in rare earth magnets needed for electric power steering systems. Tesla faced similar disruptions at multiple manufacturing facilities across the country. US automakers issued public warnings that vehicle production could stop completely, grinding to a total halt within weeks if the Chinese export restrictions continued. One brief export restriction from one country nearly paralyzed American automotive manufacturing. Now imagine what happens if Canada, which supplies massive quantities of the exact minerals needed specifically to reduce Chinese dependency, suddenly becomes unreliable as a partner because America is threatening annexation and imposing punitive tariffs. You're not solving the China dependency problem. You're making it catastrophically worse by destroying the alternative supply source that was supposed to provide strategic independence. And speaking of automotive manufacturing, because we've already touched on it, let's discuss in detail how cars actually get built in North America. Because the level of integration between American and Canadian auto production isn't just close or interconnected in some general sense. It operates at what industry experts literally describe as a molecular level. A single automobile assembled in Detroit might physically cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times during its production cycle, sometimes more. Components get manufactured in Ontario and shipped to Michigan for subassembly operations. Those subassemblies travel back north to Canada for integration into larger systems. The finished modules return south to the United States for final vehicle assembly. This isn't inefficiency that needs correction. This isn't poor planning that requires fixing. This is decades of optimization. This is billions of dollars invested over generations in synchronized supply chains that treat the border as an accounting distinction, as a line on maps, not as a meaningful barrier to production flow. Canadian manufactured auto parts flow into American factories at a rate measuring billions of dollars every single month. Engines, transmissions, electrical systems, safety components, interior systems, braking systems. The integration is so complete, so thorough, so fundamental, that industry analysts use a specific phrase to describe the impossibility of separation. You can't unscramble an egg. Ontario alone, just one Canadian province, supports 675,000 jobs directly tied to exports to American markets. That's more than the population of many American cities. Many of those jobs involve manufacturing parts that American vehicles literally, physically cannot be built without. Not parts that would be expensive to source elsewhere. Not parts where alternatives exist at higher cost. Parts that have no alternatives available. Components where the only supplier with the technical capability and production capacity is located in Canada. Tariffs, trade barriers, or supply chain disruptions don't just increase vehicle prices by a few percentage points. They force complete redesign of production networks that were built up over multiple generations through massive capital investment and careful optimization. We're talking about years of reconfiguration work, tens of billions of dollars in new capital expenditure, and massive unemployment on both sides of the border during any transition period as old facilities close before new ones open. And all of this economic integration exists within a specific legal and regulatory framework. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, the comprehensive trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020. That agreement was negotiated over years, signed with great ceremony, and implemented specifically to lock in North American economic integration, to create certainty and predictability, to allow businesses to invest capital with confidence that the fundamental rules wouldn't suddenly change based on political mood swings or electoral cycles. But when the president threatens repeatedly to make Canada the 51st state, when he publicly declares that America doesn't need Canadian goods, when he imposes tariffs that violate the spirit, if not the technical letter of agreements he personally signed and celebrated, that certainty evaporates instantly. That predictability disappears. And markets, investors, businesses, they all hate uncertainty more than they hate almost anything else. Uncertainty freezes investment decisions. Uncertainty triggers defensive behavior. Uncertainty destroys economic value even before any actual policy changes get implemented. Let me give you the actual trade numbers, because facts matter more than rhetoric, more than talking points, more than what sounds good at campaign rallies. In 2024, the United States imported $422 billion worth of goods from Canada. That's not a typo. $422 billion. America exported $348 billion worth of goods to Canada. That creates a bilateral trade deficit of approximately $74 billion in goods. But when you include trade in services, which is a massive and growing part of modern economies, and where the United States dominates the relationship, the deficit shrinks substantially to somewhere between $36 and $45 billion, depending on specific measurement methodology. Now, the president has repeatedly claimed the deficit is $200 billion. He states this figure frequently and with confidence. That number appears nowhere in official statistics. Not from the US Census Bureau, which tracks trade data meticulously, not from Statistics Canada, not from any recognized trade authority anywhere in the world. It's inflated by a factor of approximately 4 or 5. But here's the more fundamental point that matters beyond the specific numbers. Even if that $200 billion figure were somehow accurate, even if official statistics were wrong by a factor of 4, a trade deficit is not a subsidy. A trade deficit doesn't mean Americans are giving Canada money out of charity or goodwill or obligation. They're receiving real value in exchange. Energy that keeps American lights on and vehicles running. Minerals that make American electronics function. Auto parts that build American vehicles. Lumber that constructs American homes. Real physical products that American consumers and businesses actively need, purchase voluntarily, and use daily. The trade relationship exists, has existed for generations, because both countries benefit enormously from it. Canada gets reliable access to the world's largest consumer market. America gets reliable supplies of essential materials at competitive prices from a stable, democratic, friendly neighbor that shares fundamental values and security interests. Disrupting that mutually beneficial arrangement doesn't make America more independent or stronger. It makes America more expensive, less efficient, and strategically weaker on the global stage. And here's something that almost every news story and analysis piece completely misses. Canada isn't just dependent on the United States. The dependency runs both directions. It's asymmetric in ways that create significant vulnerabilities on both sides of the border. Take electricity as a prime example. 86 international power lines physically connect American states to Canadian provinces. The electricity systems aren't just linked, they're fully integrated and interdependent. Canada exports substantial amounts of clean hydroelectric power to northeastern American states. America exports power to parts of Canada during periods when their demand spikes. It's balanced exchange that improves reliability, reduces costs, and strengthens energy security for everyone involved. But when Canadian provincial governments threatened to cut electricity exports in direct response to Trump's tariff threats, states like New York and Michigan suddenly realized with considerable alarm how dependent their electrical grids are on northern supply. Ontario Premier Doug Ford proposed then quickly withdrew a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the United States. Just the threat, without any actual implementation, without any power actually being cut, was sufficient to send American state officials into emergency negotiations and federal officials scrambling to find solutions. Or consider this often overlooked reality. Parts of Canada, particularly the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, depend heavily on oil and natural gas that transits through American territory on its way to Canadian markets. About half the natural gas consumed in these provinces originates from American sources or passes through American pipelines. Quebec's Montreal refinery, a critical piece of energy infrastructure, runs entirely on crude oil delivered via the United States, with zero immediate alternatives available for supply. So Canada has significant vulnerabilities too, energy insecurity that American policy could theoretically exploit if the relationship became genuinely hostile. But here's the critical distinction that current policy seems completely incapable of grasping. When you're in a relationship fundamentally characterized by mutual dependency, weaponizing that dependency doesn't just hurt the other side, it damages both severely. And perhaps more importantly for the long term, it destroys the trust and goodwill that make future cooperation and compromise possible. Trust that required generations to build carefully can be destroyed in mere months through hostile policy and threatening rhetoric. Right now, as we speak in January 2026, that trust is eroding at an alarming and accelerating rate. Trump has repeatedly, publicly, floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, not as a joke, not as rhetorical flourish. As an actual policy goal he discusses seriously. He consistently refers to Prime Minister Mark Carney not as Prime Minister but as Governor, language deliberately chosen to imply subordinate status. He posts AI-generated images on social media showing Canada, along with Greenland and Venezuela, as American territory. He's threatened military action to acquire territory, then clarified somewhat that he means economic force rather than actual military invasion, which somehow doesn't make the threat less alarming or destabilizing to Canadians watching all of this unfold. Canadian public opinion polling shows that 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. 90%. That's not a narrow majority. That's overwhelming consensus across every demographic group, every region, every political affiliation. In an April 2025 poll that captured international attention, 82% of Canadians said they would rather become a dominion of the British Empire again than be annexed by the United States. Think carefully about what that means. Canadians are so opposed to this idea, so committed to maintaining their independence, that they would prefer going backwards in time to colonial status, returning to a system they fought to leave, rather than becoming American. That's how strong the opposition is. That's how seriously they take their sovereignty. And it's not just public opinion reflected in polling data. Canadian politicians across the entire political spectrum, from liberals to conservatives to the NDP, politicians who agree on almost nothing else, have united completely in opposition to annexation. Canada will never be the 51st state, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre declared in Parliament. There isn't a snowball's chance in hell, said former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Never, 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 Prime Minister Mark Carney told Trump directly to his face during a phone call. But the damage being done isn't merely diplomatic hurt feelings or wounded national pride. It's profoundly, materially economic. Uncertainty is absolute poison for investment decisions. When businesses don't know if tariffs will be imposed tomorrow, if borders will be respected next month, if trade agreements will be honored next year, they respond predictably. They stop investing. They hoard cash. They delay expansion projects indefinitely. They actively look for alternative markets and supply sources. And Canada, faced with an increasingly unpredictable southern neighbor, is finding those alternatives. In the first 10 months of 2025, Canadian exports to the United States fell 4.1% compared to the identical period in 2024. That's not a minor fluctuation. That's a measurable, significant decline. Meanwhile, Canadian exports to countries other than the United States have been growing steadily. Canada is actively, deliberately diversifying away from American dependency, not because it's economically optimal in the short term, not because other markets are as large or as close or as compatible, because relying on an unpredictable partner, a partner that threatens annexation and imposes arbitrary tariffs, has become a strategic risk that responsible Canadian policymakers cannot ignore. So let's play this scenario out to its logical conclusion. Let's be very specific and concrete about what actually happens in practice if America genuinely tries to function without Canadian supply. Gas prices spike immediately and dramatically, 30 to 70 cents per gallon within weeks, possibly more if markets panic and speculation intensifies. Every American who drives feels this immediately in their wallet. Home heating costs rise substantially as natural gas supplies tighten across the Northeast and Midwest. Families pay more to stay warm. Businesses pay more to operate. Electricity prices jump sharply in regions dependent on Canadian supply. Industrial users face higher costs that get passed to consumers. Rolling blackouts become a genuine possibility during peak winter demand when heating systems strain electrical capacity. New York, Boston, Detroit, Chicago all face potential power disruptions. Automobile production slows dramatically, then stops entirely in many facilities as parts shortages cascade through deeply integrated supply chains. Vehicle prices rise as manufacturers scramble desperately to find alternative suppliers who may not exist. Delivery times stretch from typical weeks to months to potentially longer. New car market freezes. Used car prices spike. Transportation costs throughout the economy increase. Defense contractors struggle to source critical minerals essential for weapons systems production. F-35 fighter jet production faces immediate delays affecting delivery schedules to Air Force. Submarine construction stalls at multiple shipyards. Missile manufacturing hits severe bottlenecks. The Pentagon's carefully constructed strategy to reduce Chinese dependency on rare earth elements collapses completely because the Canadian alternative supply source has been destroyed through hostile trade policy. Food prices rise across every category as fertilizer costs jump due to potash shortages affecting agricultural production nationwide. Agricultural yields drop measurably as farmers reduce fertilizer application. Farmers pay dramatically more for the inputs they need, and pass those increased costs directly to consumers. Grocery bills increase for everyone. Restaurant prices rise. Food insecurity increases for vulnerable populations. Electronics manufacturing faces serious disruptions throughout the sector. Computer production slows. Smartphone assembly faces component shortages. Data center construction delays. All of these industries depend heavily on minerals that Canada supplies reliably. Shortages ripple unpredictably through technology supply chains, creating bottlenecks nobody anticipated. And all of this economic chaos unfolds while America is simultaneously fighting trade wars with China, threatening Europe with tariffs and withdrawal from NATO, and trying to maintain global economic leadership and credibility. Allies around the world watch as the United States treats its closest and most reliable partner with open hostility and contempt, and wonder reasonably, rationally, if they might be next on the list. Trust erodes, not just with Canada but globally. Coalitions fracture. Alliance commitments seem uncertain. American influence and soft power wane substantially. Now let me be absolutely clear about something important. None of this analysis means Canada is perfect, or that the bilateral relationship doesn't have genuine issues requiring attention and negotiation. Trade disputes over dairy policy, over lumber pricing mechanisms, over other specific sectors are real and legitimate. Border security is a valid concern requiring serious cooperation and adequate resources. Balanced economic relationships require ongoing negotiation and periodic adjustment as circumstances change. That's completely normal. That's healthy. That's how partnerships work. But there's a fundamental difference between tough negotiation within a framework of mutual respect and deliberate destabilization of the entire relationship. Between pushing hard for better terms while maintaining the partnership and threatening to blow up the entire framework. Between using leverage strategically to achieve specific goals and attempting to destroy the relationship itself. What we're watching right now isn't tough negotiation. It's a stress test. A test not just of US-Canada relations specifically, but of whether American power can be wielded productively to achieve positive outcomes, or whether it simply collapses into chaos and alienates essential partners. Whether allies can trust American commitments long-term, or whether every agreement, no matter how carefully negotiated, is subject to being torn up based on presidential whim or political calculation. The answer to those questions matters far beyond trade statistics or economic models. It determines fundamentally whether America can build and maintain the coalitions necessary to compete effectively with China and other rising powers. Whether democracies can cooperate effectively in an increasingly authoritarian world, whether the post-World War II order of rules-based trade and alliance commitments survives or gives way completely to pure power politics, where might makes right and agreements mean nothing. And here's what frustrates everyone who actually understands how these complex systems function. The irony. The complete, almost comical irony of declaring confidently that we don't need Canada while being deeply, structurally dependent on Canadian resources and cooperation for maintaining basic American living standards. You don't need Canadian energy. 4 million barrels per day of crude oil and 8 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily say very differently. You don't need Canadian minerals. The Pentagon's entire critical mineral strategy is built fundamentally around reliable Canadian supply. You don't need Canadian auto parts. Detroit's entire manufacturing ecosystem would like a word about that claim. You don't need Canadian lumber. American housing construction depends on it and has no ready domestic substitute. The rhetoric of independence and self-sufficiency crashes headfirst into the reality of deep interdependence. And reality, as much as we might wish otherwise, doesn't care about talking points or campaign slogans or what plays well at political rallies. Reality is refineries specifically configured to process only Canadian crude that cannot function without it. Reality is power grids fundamentally dependent on Canadian electricity that face blackouts without it. Reality is assembly lines that stop completely without Canadian parts arriving on schedule. Reality is defense systems requiring Canadian minerals that cannot be built without them. Reality is supply chains optimized meticulously over generations through billions in investment that cannot be quickly or cheaply reconfigured. So here's where we actually are right at this moment. A president claiming repeatedly and confidently that America doesn't need Canada. A neighbor where 90% of the population adamantly opposes becoming American. Supply chains integrated over multiple generations through massive investment. Dependencies running deeply in both directions, creating vulnerability for both. Trust eroding rapidly on a daily basis. And consequences that most ordinary people won't understand or recognize until they're personally paying substantially more at the gas pump, at the grocery store checkout, for their next vehicle purchase, for everything that depends on the largely invisible machinery of North American trade that people have taken completely for granted. This situation isn't sustainable over any reasonable time horizon. Something has to give. Either the hostile rhetoric moderates substantially and relationships begin to stabilize and repair, or the deep economic integration starts unwinding, and both countries pay severe economic prices. There's simply no version of this scenario where America successfully goes it alone, cuts ties with Canada, without experiencing significant, lasting, widespread economic pain. The dependencies are too deep, the alternatives are too expensive or don't exist. The timeline for transition is too long. The disruption to daily life is too severe. Canada isn't some distant trading partner on another continent that America could replace with minimal disruption and mild temporary inconvenience. It's the immediate neighbor whose economy has been fused with America's at every conceivable level through conscious choices and massive investments over generations. Energy systems interconnected, mineral supply integrated, manufacturing networks synchronized, agricultural inputs shared, service industries overlapping. 76% of Canadian exports flow to the United States because of geographic proximity and economic integration. But America depends on those exports flowing smoothly more than most people realize, more than most politicians understand, more than the confident rhetoric acknowledges. You want to know what actually happens in practice when America loudly declares we don't need Canada? Watch gas prices climb steadily higher. Watch electricity costs spike across multiple regions. Watch vehicle availability collapse as production stops. Watch defense, weapons production struggle and delay. Watch food prices rise across every category. Watch technology, supply chains break down. Watch every single sector where Canadian inputs have been taken for granted for so long that people forgot they even existed, forgot where they came from, forgot how essential they are. And then watch carefully as Canada, faced with an unreliable, hostile, threatening partner, diversifies systematically away from American dependency toward markets in Europe and Asia. Watch as the deep economic integration that made both countries stronger, more prosperous, more secure slowly and painfully unwinds. Watch as competitors, rivals, adversaries eagerly fill gaps and seize opportunities that America created through its own choices, its own rhetoric, its own policies. This is what happens not in theoretical economic models, but in the real world, where supply and demand and infrastructure and investment decisions determine whether lights stay on and cars get built and weapon systems function properly. Food reaches markets at affordable prices. The president says confidently that America doesn't need Canada. The data accumulated over decades says something very different. The supply chains built over generations say something very different. The actual physical reality of how North America functions economically says something very different. And when confident rhetoric collides with stubborn reality, reality wins every single time. Eventually, the only real question is how much damage gets done, how many jobs are lost, how much wealth is destroyed, how many essential relationships are fractured before that lesson finally, painfully sinks in. If this detailed breakdown helped you understand what's genuinely at stake in US-Canada relations, not just the political headlines, but the actual dependencies and real consequences affecting daily life, consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment below. Do you think this critical relationship can be repaired and restored, or are we watching the beginning of a fundamental, irreversible shift in how North America works? I'm genuinely curious what you think about where all of this is heading.